The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, First Robotics community. My name is Sean Lim, and I'm the Director of District Implementation for First Robotics Canada. And thanks very much for joining us for another edition of Ask the Experts. Tonight's webinar is going to be a nice little recap of actually a historic event. If you were there, you got a chance to see the Week 1 Durham College District event, the very first district event in the province of Ontario. And a lot of commentary about that event, just from a logistical point of view, something I'm personally pretty proud of because being responsible for the district implementation, I guess I had a lot of vested or interest in the event running well. And, we were very glad to have the event, despite just a few glitches and running, a few minutes late on the first day. It otherwise was a very, very successful event. But to help us recap this event and maybe talk a little bit about the strategies that we saw there and how this game is maybe going to evolve over the next few weeks and give you some pointers on how to modify your robots or strategize with them to see more success as the weeks go by, we have a very special panelist with us, Matt Glanfield. Was actually a referee at the Durham College event, so he was a fortunate holder of the best seats in the house, right front and center at field side. Matt, great to have you on the call with us. Matt, how are you doing this evening?
Doing well, thank you, Sean.
All right, well, you know what? There's actually kind of a good amount of content to cover this evening, so without further ado, we'll get right into it. And a lot of the times when we sort of recap one of these events, we like to use a website called the Blue Alliance. So we're just going to spend a few minutes between Matt and myself to show you this website. But to go to the website, it's basically thebluealliance.com. And when you go to the Blue Alliance, you'll see this website. And this is a kind of a community-maintained central statistics repository for basically every single official and even some of the unofficial robotics or first robotics competition events that go on. And so last week was the very first official week of competition. And so on the front page, you'll see the week 1 events that have happened, of which there's a good number of them. And closer to the top here, we've got the Ontario District Durham College event. And if I click there, the landing page for this event shows you a very comprehensive listing of the results from every single one of the matches. On the right side, it'll show you how the alliances came together, who was the captain, and who did they pick. And if you scroll down, it'll show you the playoff results. And it looks like there's even some videos that have been posted up from one of the matches. And ultimately, who wins, how the playoff brackets unfolded. And down here, there's an interesting statistic here called OPR. And so amongst the first community, this is a number that's very well known, for better or for worse, but it's actually a number that's determined based on some matrix algebra to try and calculate just how many points a specific team contributed to their alliance's score, and being strictly a mathematical calculation and not based on actual observation. Sometimes there can be inaccuracies or problems with these numbers, but there are a number of teams which do look at them as a data point, and sometimes people feel that they give you pretty good representation on who the stronger teams were at the event and who was scoring more points as a result. And so because of these calculated OPRs, one of the analyses that I like to do is to kind of compare the OPRs and the rankings of these numbers versus the actual rankings from the event. And when I click on that, the rankings number, we'll see how they actually ranked. And at this event, it was actually pretty close. So Matt, I didn't know if I had a chance to look at these before, but there's a pretty strong correlation between them. But either way, if you are scouting and you're trying to figure out, well, maybe who was the stronger robots at the events, generally looking at the rankings, and in prior years, this OPR number used to give you a pretty good indicator. But Matt, you probably have a little comment to make about that in terms of, do you trust this OPR, this mathematically calculated number for this particular year? I get the sense that maybe you don't for this year.
Yeah. So the OPR can be a very useful tool some years, but it it's generally more accurate for games that have a high number of scoring tasks completed. So not gears and not climbing, maybe fuel. But since fuel hasn't been used too much, most of the OPR is made up by gears and climbing, and the statistics that go on behind the scenes don't really accurately represent a team's strength this year too much.
Yeah.
So it's a great tool, but maybe don't base your entire pick list off of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I would share those sentiments about OPR for this year, and that's not to say that these high-ranking OPR teams weren't good. I would actually say that they were some of the stronger ones, but for this particular event, that doesn't necessarily mean that some teams sort of in the middle here weren't necessarily just as strong or even stronger. And what's interesting is you will see at this event that the two strongest teams in terms of OPR did get a chance to pick each other. They were members of the first overall alliance, 45-25 and 2609 being the first overall pick. But unfortunately, they were ultimately eliminated in the semifinals, in fact, by the 2200 772 6323 alliance. And we'll talk about that alliance, actually, and particularly 6323 later on. And that doesn't really come as too much of a surprise to me. But we'll talk about the reasons why later on. But OPR, very interesting number to look at. But I think, Matt, you really like one particular area on the Blue Alliance, and that is the Insights button, which I will click on. And this is a really interesting one. Matt, would you mind sharing just some of your thoughts on what some of these numbers might tell us about an event as a whole?
Yeah, so this is relatively new. I think the Blue Alliance started doing it at some point last year, but it's much more improved, I think, this year. It kind of gives you an idea of the event overall. You can't really use it for scouting or anything, but looking back on the event, you can see that for this event, about 80% of the robots moved in auto and were able to get those 5 points, and 40% of the robots were able to climb in all the quals matches, which is pretty high for an event.
Yeah, I'd say that's very high considering qualification matches are essentially randomly matched robots put into, an alliance together. But I know when I look at this page, I tend to focus more so on the playoff side where teams have really had a chance to construct their alliances. And this is where the numbers really get kind of interesting and, a little scary in fact. But, those same two statistics that Matt just pointed out, auto mobility, when these teams have had a chance to select their partners and you kind of get the top 24 teams playing with each other and strategizing and kind of matched properly based on scouting, that auto mobility success rate went up to 99.07%. Teleop takeoff, the climb rates, like this is a pretty strong number. This is 2 out of 3 every single match on average, sorry, not every single match, but on average, 2 out of 3. That's pretty good. And the number that I think I was really interested in at Durham College in particular was how many rotors were engaged. And the rotor 3 engaged, right over here, 75% of all alliances were able to engage 3 rotors, which we'll talk about this number a little bit more. And actually, I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick comparison, not to try and toot our own horns here in Ontario, but I'm going to flip over to another event that happened the same weekend. And this was the event that I think most people were tuning into because it basically hosted some of the top teams in Texas. And Texas is a hotbed for FRC. Some very, very strong teams out there who are playing in this particular tournament. But the Hub City Regional, if we kind of compare those same numbers, particularly on the playoff side, well, okay, automobility, 90%, that's still pretty darn good. But when you're talking now here, how many percent were able to get that rotor 3 engaged? You're talking less than 45% over here. And so that's a pretty significant difference, That's less than half. So chances are, if you're watching a playoff match in Texas that weekend, chances are that alliance was not going to get 3 rotors engaged, whereas in Ontario at Durham College, chances are you were going to get your three rotors engaged. And what's interesting is, I think people didn't pay a whole lot of attention to Durham just because the list of teams out there were not really, Ontario's most well-known teams. But underhandedly, those of us up here in Ontario who keep track of these teams, we actually knew that this was going to be a pretty strong, pretty strong competition where, even if you weren't quite in the elite tier of teams in Ontario, those teams are still really competitive. And, these numbers sort of tell me if you airdrop them into the Hub City Regional, they probably they probably would have had a pretty good go there. But Matt,
Yeah,
do you have anything else that you wanted to add?
yeah, I did actually. One of the unique things about this event was, unlike a lot of first events, the field at Durham was pretty level all the way across. Some of the third picks on alliances and some of the robots that didn't get picked easily could have been alliance captains had some quals gone differently. And just the overall robot ability, pretty even throughout most of the robots at the event.
Yeah,
It's unique.
and very unique, and specifically in terms of capabilities, the climb capability was very deep in this field. Like, I don't know if there were 24 teams that could climb at other regionals or district events, but when we look at Durham and we look at the alliances, that very last pick, Alliance 1's second pick, 4914 out of Victoria Park, that robot was climbing. you know. Uh,
Yep.
it was pretty incredible to see. Very, very impressive field at Durham. And so we had a chance to talk about the Blue Alliance. So enough numbers and statistics. Let's talk just a little bit more about maybe the strategy side. But Matt, we saw a lot of gear-focused play at Durham, where in the qualification matches and in the playoff matches, basically all the alliances were focusing on just cycling as many gears as they could, and bringing them to the airship. And maybe I'll qualify that. Bringing as many gears as they needed to the airship as quickly and efficiently and successfully as possible. And we'll talk about that little detail of why I said it that way in a little bit. But it was a lot of gear-focused play, and then basically by the time the playoffs hit, you also basically needed all three robots to climb, because there's a good chance, an alliance could do it, especially the top few alliances as you hit the semis and the finals. We were seeing a lot of, triple climbs at the end of the matches. So we got to the situation where teams basically needed to get three rotors and three climbs, and that would give you a base kind of number of points. And it became sort of a game of mistakes, who kind of messed up getting those three rotors and three climbs. And Matt, would you agree? Is that kind of what you saw in terms of the primary strategy being played?
Yeah. So if you look at the scores of all of the elimination matches, many of them are within single-digit points, and the ones that aren't, from having a first row seat to them, I would say most of them were because of a last-second snapped rope, or just didn't quite get to the touchpad, or that last gear wouldn't sit on the peg and fell off. Like, pretty much every alliance was right on that three rotors, three climb, and just got unlucky.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And honestly, it made for a really entertaining game when the games unfolded this way and when the teams played this particular strategy. And a lot of it came down to whether they could hit the triple climb, because the climb being worth so much, a 50-point swing, the margin of victory was usually less than, the margin or the points of a climb. And so, yeah, usually the games were down to the wire on whether a team could reliably hit those three climbs. But it definitely became a game of mistakes, and it was really neat to see. So whether that was an intentional aspect of the game design or not, I think we really enjoyed it, particularly being so close to the action and being able to see these teams acquire the rope and winch themselves up and maybe struggle a little bit to get there. Which brings us to, sort of the next point that could be a little controversial, but we definitely wanted to address. But Matt, I've got my opinion on this one, but I want to hear from you. Like, basically, if you want to have a robot that's competitive and I'll make it sound a little bit harsh here. If you expect to be picked in the elimination rounds to an alliance, do you feel that climbing is mandatory?
Yes, absolutely. I think that if you'd gone into Durham and on Saturday night, based your pick list almost exclusively on climbing, you had a good shot at winning the event. The 3 rotors isn't too hard to do between 3 robots. We sometimes saw one robot doing 3 rotors and the other 2 playing defense. So, you know, if you're one of those stellar robots that can do 3 rotors by yourself in a match, after auto, of course, then yeah, you need those 2 climbs from the other 2 robots.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and this is kind of a harsh question to ask, particularly at this time of the year, because a lot of teams, they made their design trade-offs, and I'm sure there's a good number of them who basically gave up climbing to try and pursue a different mechanism. But at this stage, the way that the game is playing out, it certainly feels like climbing is a mandatory part of this game if you expect to be competitive and you want to be involved in the elimination rounds. However, there was one interesting sort of very small exception to this case, which I think, Matt, you and I discussed a little earlier, which I thought was really interesting. But Matt, what was that? What was that really interesting sort of caveat where maybe climbing for a robot wouldn't be necessary to best benefit your alliance?
Yeah, so this kind of goes into week 1 events not really being a good example of how the game will be played at champs or district champs or even week 6. But if you're a robot or an alliance that can get that 40 kPa or the 4 rotors, those bonus points make it more worth it to do those tasks than climbing.
Yeah,
so if you have a stellar high goal shooter and you get those 40 kPa points and the 20-point bonus, that's 60 points. That's 10 points more than a climb. So it's risky, but it could be worth it.
Yeah, and we have yet to see the game played at that high of a level quite just yet, so we can't really say how likely that's going to be, but you're 100% correct. Like, if at the end of a match you're kind of making the choice between climbing versus finishing off that 40 kPa, finishing off that 40 kPa is going to get you more points. Same thing with that 4th rotor. Last 30 seconds of the match, you have a choice to climb, but you're close to getting that 4th rotor. You should probably stick around and just get that 4th rotor. So it's interesting in that at the super, super, super high levels of play, you might be able to justify not climbing, but still, if you can finish the 40 kPa and then climb afterwards, you're still better off. And likewise, if you can finish the 4th rotor and then climb on top of that, you're still even better. So you could always make the argument that climbing is still going to give you, the best option. And at this point, it still seems like climbing is less risky than trying to figure out those or complete those other 2 bonuses. And that's more so because we just haven't seen it yet. But it'll be interesting as the weeks go by, as teams actually do it, how easy it ends up being and whether teams do forego climbing. But I seem to think that climbing is probably going to be the go-to end game, and just because it's a little safer, I think some teams will still err to the side of caution there, whether on purpose or unintentionally. But that's a really, really interesting one. But because climbing is mandatory, I think this also plays a very interesting dynamic in terms of helping or hurting the alliances. And so when you're doing your alliance selections, if you don't have a super deep field of teams to pick from, let's say you only have, 20 robots which are capable of climbing at your event, that begins to give a huge advantage to your lower ranked alliances because of the Serpentine draft. They'll have the opportunity to pick, that second pick earlier and to be able to sweep up a reliable climber versus, as the higher ranked alliances pick later and later and later, they may be stuck with a robot that can't climb at all. And a 50-point disadvantage, that's a huge swing. And so I have a feeling that in the earlier weeks with fields which are not as deep, you're going to see a lot of upsets. And in fact, this is the crazy strategy, which, there are teams who think this way, that it might be more beneficial to actually be ranked a little bit lower and picking from some of these spots if you know that the field is not that deep and you need to pick up a robot that's capable of climbing in that second round. Matt, do you think that's something that we might see?
I don't know about robots intentionally ranking lower to try and pick, because that's always a gamble, but definitely cheesecake and climbers. it could be huge at some events. You know, you get around to that 24th pick and maybe no climbers left, but if you have something in your back pocket that you can strap to a robot, and we saw some of that in Durham actually. I think a couple robots got cheesecake climbers. I think Waffles did, and I think 6323 did as well. Hayden Robotics.
Really, I actually didn't know that, Matt. That's really interesting. And so, for those of you who aren't familiar with this cheesecaking term, I don't know how it came about. It seems very strange, but it's kind of a term that we use really only in FIRST Robotics. But the term cheesecake means for one, usually a higher ranked team, will bring as part of their 30-pound withholding allowance something like a climbing mechanism that they could then offer to their second pick team to be able to bolt onto their robot to give them increased functionality. And so, you know, your number one alliance captain could pick a robot that doesn't have the climbing ability, or the ability to climb rather, and offer them basically, you know, an attachment to bolt onto the robot that would give them the ability to climb. And so that's a really interesting dynamic, because in prior years, I would have said a climbing mechanism was probably something that was too difficult to cheesecake. But this year, seeing some of the super elegant climbing mechanisms that teams have come up with, 100% doable. And I expect this to be something that's will become a lot more popular as the weeks go by, especially if you know you're going into an event without a deep field. If you're a top-ranked team, it might behoove you to come with a cheesecake climber. Whether you agree with this concept of cheesecake or not, you know, is really up to you. But you will see teams do this. There's a huge advantage here because there are some potential issues with the depth of the field there. But great point, Matt. I didn't know that there was cheesecake involved at the Durham College event. Very cool.
Yep.
All right. Well, moving on, we have another topic that we wanted to touch upon, which was the importance of fuel, which is really interesting because we did not see a whole lot of fuel shot at Durham College. However, Matt, even though we didn't see a whole lot of fuel shot, what are your thoughts on the importance of fuel? Because normally, if we didn't see a whole lot of fuel, you'd sort of say, it's really not that important then. So, you know, that's why people aren't really concentrating on it. But where do you see fuel going with the game, Matt?
So it seemed almost useless for quals, and I think a lot of teams were mostly ignoring it through quals, even teams that were highly capable, like Team Dave. And it's not too valuable in eliminations matches either. It's just not, you know, 3-8 points around what most teams were scoring. Just doesn't put you over the edge into a guaranteed win. But as we were saying earlier, a lot of the elimination matches were essentially ties. An auto gear or an auto rotor, 3 rotors and 3 climbs, and both alliances are tied for pretty much all the elimination matches at this event. And the differentiator there was fuel, which makes it very important, but only as a tiebreaker.
Yeah, and this showed some really interesting dynamics. I agree with you 100%. Like the 3 rotors, 3 climbs becoming this kind of base score that you could expect, you know, most of your alliances to be able to achieve, and that gets you a tie. You're looking for those differentiators, and fuel was definitely one of them. And there were some alliances which were picking up on this fact, and so when we were watching some of the earlier matches, or maybe some of the less experienced teams who were just cycling gears, trying to get as many as they could onto the airship, what we saw a lot of was they would deliver gears and enough to engage 3 rotors, but then they would start delivering, or they would continue to deliver even more gears, extra gears. And this would be late in the game where they knew, well, I won't say they knew, but where there was really no chance that they would be able to deliver enough to engage the 4th rotor. And so those were wasted gears because you don't get points for any of those individual gears. You've got to finish that 4th rotor before you score any more points. So you're cycling these gears, and they're basically dead gears. They're 0 gears. And I saw this happen quite a bit. In the elimination rounds, though, as you had maybe some of the more experienced teams or some of the streams who really dialed in the strategy, they were cycling much faster. And what was interesting is they would get that 3rd rotor, the bare minimum number of gears to get it, and this could be much earlier in the match, and then they would switch over because they still knew that, oh, there's no chance that I'm going to get that fourth rotor, so, or it's too risky to even try because the chances of success were not in their favor. And then they would switch over late game to a completely different strategy. They would basically switch over to some kind of shutdown defense, or at that point, if you had the ability to score fuel, and you mentioned 3683, a highly capable robot of shooting fuel. Ironically, though, they shot the fuel into the low goal, at least the few times that I saw it, at an incredibly fast rate. And it was only good for maybe a handful of points. But man, were those points, they could have been differentiators in a lot of matches if both alliances were basically good for 3 rotors, 3 climbs. They could have won matches by just a handful of points easily. And so I hope alliances pick up on that strategy where, unless you have the gear scoring power where that fourth rotor is almost guaranteed, you should probably stop at 3 rotors and have your coaches really on the ball and counting those gears and switch over to a different type of strategy late game that's going to benefit your team more, whether it's shutting down the other team or if it's switching over to fuel or anything of the sort. But Matt, any other comments on that?
Dave, the team we were just mentioning, 3683, they were taking it to a different level as well of that strategy. They were letting their alliance captain, Robodevils 5036, focus gears, and they were spending just about the entirety of teleop scoring low goal, dumping hoppers, picking up balls off the ground and scoring them in the low goal. They happened to pick very good picks, 3 robots that could score gears in auto. So by the end of auto, in the beginning stages of teleop, they would have 3 gears in the airship, and it was only 4 gears left. They knew 5036 could score 4 in teleop, even with defense. That let Waffles play defense and Dave focus entirely on fuel. And it got them to semis and took it to the eventual winners, took 3 matches.
Wow, that's pretty gutsy. That's pretty gutsy to put the faith into your 2 partners to handle the gear scoring, knowing that you would stop at the 3 rotors and you could hit it comfortably, but also knowing that even if you added the 3rd robot, even if it's Team Dave, which is a very reputable team, very capable team, but knowing that that's still not going to get you the 4th rotor, I would say that's 100% the right choice to have made. So I didn't know that. Thanks for pointing that out. But that's a really, really neat strategy. Really gutsy, but good for them. But I guess I'm not that surprised. Team Dave does have a reputation for making some pretty brilliant strategic calls, both on the field and even in the design of their robots. So
they seem to know. They seem, reveal day to know how week 1 events are going to go and build the right robot for the job.
Yeah, very cool. But in terms of those differentiators, it's still early in the season, so I would say there are still 2 other differentiators which were more important than fuel. You've already mentioned one of them, which was the Auton. And so, those additional 20 points for getting an Auton gear on the lift are huge. And at some point, I think we're going to see those Autons become such an important differentiator that teams will really fight for that 3 gears in Auton, 1 from each robot. But that's going to be really tricky because I think there's some interesting limiting factors there, Matt. And you'd mentioned that, it's not even the robots which are the problem. We'll see 3 robots drive up to that airship and deliver a gear and put them on the lift in Auton, and probably not too long from now, because we saw it I don't know, did we see it happen at Durham? With the 3? No, I don't think we saw it at Durham.
Yeah, I don't recall ever seeing it, but some alliances definitely came close.
Yeah.
To it.
But even at the events that it did happen somewhere, at one of the events somewhere in the world, we knew that it happened, that 3 robots delivered 3 gears to the airship. But Matt, there was still an issue with that, wasn't there?
Yes. Turns out that humans might be the limiting factor this year. It's hard to pull those lifts up, and it's hard to get the gears in the slot and on the pegs, and to spin it 3 times in 15 seconds.
Yeah, so that's going to be a really interesting one. I agree with you 100%. Pilots will be the limiting factor for a 3-gear Auton more so than the robots will. That's my impression as well. So, that might give the advantage to super capable pilots who might be able to, I don't know, operate 2 lifts at once, literally, because that's probably what it's going to take, right?
Yep.
That'll be really interesting to see, because I think some teams will be able to do it. I can't quite visualize how they're going to do 2 lifts at once with just one set of hands up there or with one person, but that'll be cool.
I've been thinking about it. Not sure either.
But I think it's going to happen. All right. Well, that
Yeah.
that pretty much wraps it up for fuel and the differentiators, and it all relates back to how important it is. Oh, sorry. The last differentiator was penalties, and we've seen a lot of matches decided by penalties, especially with the nature of that base level 3 rotors, 3 climbs score, and just looking for small incremental score changes. Penalties, were the differentiating factor quite a bit, and the tech penalty was basically it for you. If you got a tech penalty, you were probably going to lose that match, particularly at the playoffs level. So tough one there. Defense. We'll spend just a minute on this one, but we saw some defense played at Durham. Not so much in the qualification rounds, but we saw some really interesting defense in the elimination rounds. And my overall perspective was that, yes, it was effective. I was a little surprised that teams, I thought even just running a single blockade would be enough to essentially shut down an alliance. But to my surprise, most alliances were able to work around the defense. It certainly slowed them down, but I don't think I ever saw a single blockade completely shut down the gear scoring cycles of an alliance. But did you see any, observations or anything that surprised you about the defense effectiveness
It
or how it
seemed
was
like
played?
it seemed like there were two strategies. One was kind of blockade. I don't really want to use that term, but trying to block off some of the field with one robot and just to slow down every member of the opposing alliance. And the other one I think was a kind of like a 1v1 defense where you have one robot trying to shut down one other robot, generally the strongest robot on the other side. And for both of those, it wasn't quite enough to stop those 3 rotors, and any defense in the last 30 seconds was extremely prone to costly penalties, so wasn't much you could do about the climbs either.
Yeah. Oh, well, if you were, running a team, is there a style of defense that you would have a preference more towards, whether it be that one-on-one sort of man-type defense? And generally when I saw that, it was still kind of meeting them in the lane, beside the airship, versus, I guess, more of a zone-type defense, just kind of staying in that lane in between the airship and kind of playing pong by driving back and forth.
Yeah.
They both seem pretty good. I don't know if I would have had a preference, but did you see any differences?
I generally prefer kind of a hybrid between the two. I like to block off part of the field or a scoring objective with one robot as much as I can, which will delay everyone, but every time that one top robot on the other alliance comes by, delay them as much as I can. Get off that weaker robot and just harass the top robot until they leave, and then just try and get in everyone's way after that.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a mix, but
it does
I
allow
don't
you
know that there's any game-breaking defenses here, really.
No, I certainly don't think there are either, but well, at least legal ones, we'll say.
Right.
But having said that, all right, actually, before we get to some questions, there's a few notable teams that we saw at Durham, and there were some very high-powered, really teams with high brand recognition, which have really established themselves over the past few years, like 1285, 1305, 772, a lot of the low number teams. And, I think they all had strong outings in one way, shape, or form, whether it was with the robots or with the rewards. But I think there were a few who I think are in that group which are not very well unknown or really unknown Ontario teams who may have had breakout tournaments that I think we really noticed. And so there's one that I wanted to throw out there, and Matt, I think there's a few maybe you wanted to talk about as well, but there was one rookie team, 6323, and in fact I might even pull them up on the Blue Alliance. I don't know if their statistics were particularly good, but it's one of those things where you had to have been there in person and watched this robot just whip around the field and just score gears like crazy. They had a ground pickup, which is really impressive in of itself for a rookie team. And it sucked it up and it delivered it to the back of the robot and it delivered it horizontally. So it carried these gears around horizontally, drove up to the lift, and then it just had a little pneumatic flipper that just flipped the gear, kind of vertically, tipped it onto the peg, rotated it onto the peg, flipped it onto the peg. And it just looked super clean, super efficient. These guys, in my opinion, were really one of the best gear scorers in the entire tournament. And I just wanted to give them a really great shout out. And they were climbing too. And I guess, Matt, they were the recipients of a cheesecake climber, it sounds like, in the playoffs.
I think so. Not too clear, but I don't remember having seen it in quals. And then they came out on a limbs and we're climbing. So
Well, we
I would
apologize.
assume that's cheesecake, but
We'll apologize to them ahead of time if it wasn't one. So just
yeah.
it wasn't, but if it was, and regardless, kudos to them because they obviously had a really really strong outing.
And
because
even without the cheesecake, very, very impressive for a rookie team.
super impressive.
I thought they were going to go earlier in the picks, but they stuck around very late and ended up on a very good alliance.
Yeah, I was shocked. I personally thought that they should have been picked up in the first round by one of the top 8 alliance captains, but they fell ultimately to the 23rd pick from what I recall. They were the second last pick, and no, they weren't the second last pick. They were the 4th last pick. And a part of me wonders whether that was because of their rookie status. Sometimes rookies do kind of fall under the radar a little bit there. There were really only 2 rookies that were involved in the eliminations at this tournament. But I really think they should have gone much, 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 much higher. I would have had them much higher on my personal list. Another one I wanted.
Shout out to the other rookie team that was a alliance captain.
Yeah, 65-13. They had a really strong outing as well. Really, really impressive. But another robot that kind of, in my opinion, had a bit of a breakout year was Team 4939 Allspark, the second overall pick. And this was an interesting one because you could have made an argument that maybe this team should have been the first overall pick. But this was as I did my robot reveal webinar last week, we saw all these high-end veteran teams which had what I called the triple threat of robot capabilities, which were fuel shooters, gear scorers, and the climb. And I really felt that 4939 was one of the best triple threat robots at Durham. They had an autonomous that shot fuel in the high goal. They could do it in tele-op as well, but they played it very smart. They didn't need to be shooting fuel at this tournament until the elimination rounds, and they did. They were looking for those incremental few points here and there to maybe break that tie as a differentiator.
I think you skipped ahead there. 4939 was just gear and climb.
Oh, 4939 was just gear and climb? My apologies.
Similar numbers.
So really the team that we want to be talking about is the Alpha.
Well, but Allspark 9 was very good this year. As you were saying earlier, just gear and climb, but they executed it very well. I've heard that on an open field they get a ton of gears. So that translated well to defense. If you can score almost double digits of gears on an open field, then you're well off even with defense.
Yeah.
And they're not, historically they haven't been a powerhouse team, but I think this year might be their year.
Yeah, and actually I want to take a look at where else they're competing this year so that we can just kind of keep a heads up on them. They're playing in 2 more tournaments, so that bodes well for them to get that extra experience by playing that additional district event. I think they're setting themselves up. I don't want to jinx them, but I think they're setting themselves up for a really successful year. But that was definitely a team that piqued my interest for sure. But
I think they have a very good chance at their next event.
Yeah.
So I'm eager to see how they do.
But Matt, there's one more team that I think you wanted to touch base on, and that was 4946, the Alpha Dogs. And these guys
this was the one that was shooting.
Well, tell us a little bit about the Alpha Dogs.
This was a team that stood out to me in particular, having ref matches and been on the side of the field all the 2 days. They had all the parts they needed to shoot fuel, but don't ever remember seeing them do it in quals. And, they were adept at scoring gears and climbing, which got them, kind of a sleeper pick, way up on the way back, 23rd pick or something, and they came out in their first quals match with an auto routine that shot 7 out of 10 fuel into the high goal. And I think they did that for pretty much every elim match until the very end. And in many of those matches, that was the difference that won them the match.
Yeah, no, they were super impressive out there, for sure.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder if Alliance Captain 1285 knew that they had that auto, or just kind of took a gamble and picked them.
That's
I
a
think if
good
other teams
that's a
had
good
known
question.
that they would be getting 7 out of 10 in auto, they might have gone earlier.
Yeah, that's a good point because they did fall pretty late. I was shocked that they fell this far, even just based on their the gear and climb capabilities. Yet again, they fell pretty low, but I wonder if they held back the shooting capabilities until later for just that reason. But that would be an interesting one to see. That's kind of reminiscent of what happened with 610 at Waterloo last year,
Yes.
where they didn't shoot into a high goal for the entire qualification rounds, and then all of a sudden that capability kind of presented itself in the elims, and it worked out, resulting in an eventual win. So uh, that is something that happens in FRC. Teams magically
Yes.
conjure up capabilities in the elimination matches.
Yep.
Well, that's awesome, Matt. That is pretty much the formal part of our webinar. We ran actually a few minutes over, but we had a lot of good content and information to cover. But if there are any questions from anyone in the audience, now would be a great time to ask it. And in fact, we are joined this evening by Paul Keenan, our first senior mentor here at First Robotics Canada. Paul, you're here with us.
I am, Sean.
Paul, could I trouble you to maybe pull some questions from the audience, if there are any?
There are a couple. So Parth Patel is also talking about 6323, and he wants you guys maybe to talk a little bit about the effectiveness of simple robots.
Yes.
Yeah, we covered 6323, but you know what? This touches upon an interesting storyline that came up last week, which actually came up with 1285, which I wouldn't necessarily call a simple robot because it's a really beautiful robot. It's complex and simple at the same time, but the storyline was whether a robot that was just a gear intake, ground gear intake, and then could score on a lift, and then with a climber thrown on top, whether that could be successful or not. And I think the answer that we got to that at Durham was absolutely. Like 1285 kind of ran show to a certain extent for large swaths of the tournament. It goes to show that they were ranked second overall by the time everything was done. And this was with no fuel. They were just ground picking up and scoring gears. And there were enough on the ground that they did kind of these gear slam dunks quite often where they really didn't have to leave the airship area too often. They could just kind of pick up misses from both their own misses and those from their alliance partners. But even then, when they had to run cycles all the way from the feeder slot, they could just pick them up off the ground down there too and were really effective. And 6323 basically was a very similar robot to them. And I would say despite the difference in experience levels, they were, in my opinion, they were pretty comparable. They didn't see it necessarily in the rankings, but performance-wise on the field, two robots with a very similar archetype. And I would say they were two of by far the more successful robots in that field. But Matt,
and speaking to their complexity, I think the GDC might have designed a bit of a red herring into this game with fuel. I think that maybe makes it, kind of the year for the underdogs where the powerhouse teams who do everything every year tried to do fuel this year, and the complexity of it is much higher than gears. 6323, Parth pointed out their very simple robot. I think they have one pneumatic actuator.
The most important one.
Yeah, it's a drivetrain with a pneumatic cylinder, and then later they had a climber motor. And, that's two things, and that's all they had to do. But, it won them an event. And then you look at these powerhouse teams that showed off 40 kPa autonomouses, floor gear pickup, fancy climbs, all kinds of stuff, and they went to their events and, in some cases didn't see finals.
Yeah, really, really good point.
So we have a question from Paulina. She wants to know how you guys think a team can maximize their chances of getting the Rookie All-Star Award.
Paul, maybe can we maybe kindly ask you to address that one, because from what I recall, 4001 had a pretty successful rookie year, did they not?
Yes, they did. I guess in answer to Paulina's question, that work would have been done by now. The things that you do outside of the competitions prior to the season and during build season have an impact on that award. It's not just what happens at the event. So if it would be for a rookie all-star team, actually we'd probably be talking about what people who are thinking of starting a team could do to win that award next year.
Yeah, and you'd be talking about things more like sustainability, business plan,
Yeah.
fundraising, community outreach, which are all things which are just as important, if not even more important, than your raw robot performance at the competition.
Yes.
Which 4001 had all of them when you embarked on your rookie year. So, but Paul, there's still a few more questions.
Yes, Parth has a follow-up question. It was the first one, I guess. He says, gear floor pickup, yay or nay? Is it something that is an early advantage and later a waste of volume?
Great question. Matt, I'm dying to hear your answer to this one. I'm going to put you on the spot and have you go first. What are your thoughts on that?
I think Parth is answering his own questions, and that's not really fair. But so there was one elims match at the Durham event where there could have been 4 rotors spinning. And the only reason that was a possibility was because 2 robots on the Alliance had very good floor pickups. So had they abandoned the climb, they most likely would have gotten 4 rotors. I mean, probably their drive coaches couldn't see the gears on the floor, but the only way that it could have happened at Durham was with floor pickups. So had the event been a little different, I think those floor pickups could have made all the difference in the winner. And, week 2, week 3, I think they'll still be pretty useful. I think there will still be robots who don't quite have their gear catching down. They'll be dropping gears 5 feet from your airship. And if you can find a moment to snag them without getting that tech foul, definitely worth it.
So my thoughts are I'm waiting for the first match where an Alliance doesn't drop a gear on the floor, where they're totally clean, receiving it from the slot, and everyone gets delivered onto a lift. And this is kind of maybe a fool's errand to try and pursue, but I think it's going to happen. I think people will begin to realize just how precious those gears are, and pilots will become more and more disciplined to understand that, hey, once a gear is in your robot, you have to score it. You've got to treat it like your one and only shot, and it's worth it to take the extra time, no matter what it is, to make sure that it's in and on that lift perfectly. I don't think it's going to happen next week. I don't think it's going to happen week 3 even, but I think at some point we're going to have an Alliance in the eliminations where their mantra is literally score every gear, do not drop a single one. And they'll get away with running matches where, there might only be 1 dropped gear, maybe 0 if they're really, really good about it. That's kind of, the stretch goal. Yeah. But in games like that, I think the gear intake, their usefulness will diminish. And even more so if you're up against an Alliance that's going against that mantra. Most of the gears that you're stealing, at least in the early events, it feels like they're not actually coming from your own partners necessarily dropping them, but I find it still quite amazing that there's a lot of teams who drive up to that slot, and then their human players, they don't wait for it to be perfectly lined, their robots to be perfectly lined up. They just kind of chuck them down. They kind of bounce off the robot, and it creates a huge mess in the zone. And you end up with like 6 or 7 of them in the loading zone, and it's
a slippery slope. Once you get that first 1 or 2 gears, then they start piling up.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. So I think those ground pickups are going to be a huge advantage to that, but at the highest levels of the game, maybe when we're talking world championships, district championships, and later week events, I don't think there's going to be the gold mine of gears, which are both, disrupting one team and helping your opponents, that'll be there necessarily. So I don't know. If you're a team that does not have a gear pickup, I'd say it's probably gonna not be great for you for the first few weeks, but if you kind of hold true to your philosophy, and if you can find some other robots which share that same philosophy, you could build a really good alliance and compete potentially at a higher level than even the ones with the gear pickups.
I think it's kind of the FRC paradox. The robot that gets you to Worlds isn't really the robot that wins you Einstein. Floor pickup's a great way to, get to Worlds, but it's probably not going to be useful on Einstein when no robots are dropping gears. So.
Yeah, and we'll have this exact same discussion about fuel shooters at some point too. I'm absolutely sure of it.
Yep.
So our next question is allegedly from an anonymous robo builder, and Tibor would like to know where you would rate the ability to move quickly this year.
All right. Well, Matt, I put you on the spot first, so I'll take the first cut at this one. The ability to move quickly this year, deceptive. Yeah, pretty important. You want to reduce your cycle times going from point to point. In the early weeks, the faster robots appear to be able to do it faster, especially in the qual matches. One thing that I noted, though, was at Durham, I saw some matches with some pretty strong defense being played. One robot in particular, which has a pretty good history of playing strong defense, would have been in Waffles, 4476. They were playing a similar type of defense that Matt had described earlier, where it was kind of this hybrid defense, playing kind of a man-to-man, but coming back to the gap and protecting the zone when they could. It was very good. But it was interesting where if you had a really, really fast robot, single speed, for instance, Waffles would hit you. You would both be in a dead stop with each other. And then it was really more so your acceleration to try and get around each other. And the person who had just that quick burst acceleration, switching directions, and could sneak into the gap to get around the other defending robot, that would be the robot that would win that battle. And so when you go higher FPS, higher feet per second, you lose out on acceleration. So I kind of feel that this is a good game again for acceleration, and this is kind of my own bias coming back from 2013 where Team 610 had a deceptively slow robot. People said it was so fast on the field because we were spinning and dodging and getting around defense like crazy, but it was really only geared for 10 feet per second because it had amazing acceleration, and our driver just, kind of made both robots stop, get a stalemate, and then would quickly switch directions one way or another with a spin or whatever it was and could out-accelerate. So it was a little deceptive. But for me, I would actually probably say it's, I would look at the math very carefully and look at that acceleration and not just by default, build a robot that wants to go 18 feet per second.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with pretty much everything you say, other than I think fast robots are very entertaining to watch.
Yeah.
After you watch 100 matches, seeing that robot that's zipping around all over the place is fun.
Yeah. And then
definitely agility over speed, and even more important is your path planning. You don't want to run straight into Waffles. You want to go around the other side of the airship where they're not going to hit you.
Exactly, and then in order to do that, you've got to beat them to the other side of the airship, and it's just a short sprint. It's really only like a 6-foot dash, and again, if you're just in a 6-foot sprint, your acceleration is probably going to be more important. And what's really neat is that there are spreadsheets out there that have been made by some very experienced FRC teams where you can literally plug in, what gear ratio should I probably have if I want to optimize it for a 6-foot, 10-foot sprint. And that's what we did in 2013 for Team 610. We came up with a distance that we wanted to minimize the time to travel that specific distance and set our gear ratio accordingly. And we did that. But this discussion becomes a little different again if you start talking about multi-speed gearboxes, low and high gear. And that's kind of a whole beastly discussion as well. But that's one that becomes difficult because a lot of drivers I've seen who have these 2-speed gearboxes, at the end of the season you sort of ask them how many times did you actually shift, and they go, oh well, maybe like 5 over a course of a season to put that much weight and complexity into a mechanism that you only used 5 times. That's a little tough. But there are better drivers who obviously take advantage of them, and then there are even like programmers who will put in automatic shifting algorithms, which is a whole other beast. But again, I've seen a lot of multi-speed gearboxes not get used, efficiently I've seen them get used, incredibly well, and they get the best of both worlds. But yeah, if it were me and if I were a low resource team, I would probably actually look at the kit drivetrain. It's got a pretty conservative gear ratio that actually I think is ever so slightly on the side of acceleration versus as opposed to top speed. And as long as you build that cleanly and know how to drive it, you're probably in pretty darn good shape.
Yep.
Assuming you throw them four motors on. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Oh, sorry. So Paulina has a follow-up question. She wants to know, is ground pickup more important than gear auto? And can you do both, do you think, effectively?
Oh, man.
I can take this one, I guess. If you look at how Durham's elimination matches went, a big part of that was that auto score, that rotor 1 engaged in auto, 75% of the time, according to Blue Alliance Insights. And generally in elims, if a team didn't score that auto rotor, that was one of the things that lost them the match. So very, very, very important, but you only need one robot on an alliance that can do that. As we said before, it's probably pretty hard to get that 3-rotor or 3-gear auto, so you need 1 out of 3 robots to do it. And I also think you don't really need a gear floor pickup unless you're going for those 4 rotors. But you might need more than 1 to get it. So I don't know that one is necessarily better than the other, but they both have their spot.
Yeah, I think my opinion is if you have the resources to put into a gear auto, it's kind of a quick and dirty way to maximize your. I would actually do it. I would probably prioritize the gear auto, but specifically a gear auto from the left or the right lift, and that just provides you a little bit more flexibility to try and squeeze 2 autos out of your alliance, because the likelihood of you getting someone who can do the middle lift and just drive straight and put it on is far greater. And so, conversely to Matt, I'm looking at my alliance and going, hey, Matt, I can do 2 gear autos, and I've got 2 pilots up there, so I think I can squeeze out at least that extra 20 points early on. And if I'm not going to drop any gears for you, because none of my robots have, gear pickups, I'm going to starve you of gears. But yeah, I might look at the gear auto, specifically one that can do the left and or the right. If you do the left, if you do it right with sensors, theoretically you got your right one. You just got to mirror it in a perfect world. But yeah, I'd probably look at the gear auto, but specifically the left to the right side, and depend on being able to pick up an alliance member who can do the middle one and try and squeeze out two gears in auto.
Yep.
We have one last question from young Mr. Patel. He says, on the topic of loading gears and missing, should teams take the extra second to clear the drop gears in the loading zone? Maybe not for your team, but for an alliance member.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the first crack at that one. Personally, I think absolutely. Just remembering back to 2013 and how much of an emphasis we put on just completely clearing any frisbees from that loading zone. We would just universally, as soon as there was one that was dropped, you kind of just dropped everything. You reset the robot, turned it sideways, and just plowed it sideways across those intake slots just to clear the entire area. And it's tough to do. It's something that you need to practice. Like, they even practiced doing that and then spinning at the end to try and just kind of spin those frisbees right out of the corner, and then reset and go in there and load again. But yeah, generally we thought back then, and those frisbees weren't comparatively worth that much individually, but the time that you saved on subsequent cycles by keeping that area clear was definitely worth it to do. And so for me, that one's pretty clear. But that's me from my drive coaching days. Like, it sounds silly, but yeah, I would probably spend 10 seconds doing it if we needed to, just to keep that area clear, particularly if it's, early in a match. But I would do it. I would, especially if you have a double barrel loading another robot that's cycling right beside you. Like, there's not a whole lot of space to operate there. One dropped gear with 2 robots trying to come in side by side it's a death knell. you know. So really, prevention is the best. Don't drop them in the first place. But yeah, if one gear gets dropped, I would say, personally, I would clear that guy out of there as far away as you possibly can. Clear it for both slots. And this is, again, playing at a high level with
I
two
would agree
robots
with
going in and
everything you
out.
said.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you said there. I would just add that you have to be careful not to get those penalties for carrying more than one gear. You know, you have to make sure you're clearing them in a way that makes it very obvious to the reffing crew that you're not trying to herd them or, you know, gain an advantage really by pushing them out of the way, which is, you know, a bit of a gray area. So just be careful if you're going to do it. But yeah, I do think it's very worth it.
That's the end of the questions that we have for tonight.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Paul, for moderating and getting those questions out there. Before we conclude, I just wanted to let some people know that, I haven't updated the slide, but next week is not going to be a recap of week 1. It'll, in fact, be a recap of week 2. And so we will be recapping one of our larger district events at Ryerson University in the Mattamy Center, also known as the former Maple Leaf Gardens, one of our marquee events, of course. And we'll see how the game evolves, because there is a different subset of teams going out to that event. Arguably, some of our best teams in Ontario will be making an appearance out there. I guess we don't know that quite just yet until they get the robots out onto the field, but we'll say teams with pretty accomplished histories will be making the trip out to Ryerson and showing their robots off for the very first time. I think we're all pretty excited to see that as well. But beyond that, I wanted to take a moment to thank Matt Glanfield for being on the webinar with us this evening. We really appreciate your time and expertise, and also thank you for your volunteerism as a ref at the event. Thankfully, refereeing this game from your standpoint seems to be a little bit more straightforward than a lot of the previous years. Thank you again, Matt. We really appreciate you having on board, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and we'll see you next week.